Bien, alors donc on va reprendre la journée, on va la clore d'ailleurs avec un exposé de Theodore Porter. Ted Porter est un professeur à l'université de Californie à Los Angeles, autrement dit UCLA. Il est aussi là-bas le directeur du département d'histoire du groupe d'histoire des sciences. Ted Porter, on est vraiment très honoré et très heureux d'être avec Ted Porter aujourd'hui, puisque Ted est vraiment un des auteurs absolument centraux de, disons, cette sous-discipline ou cet intérêt qui est en train de naître de la sociologie, de la socio-histoire de la quantification, qui est de plus en plus unifiée et reconnaissable. Ted a écrit un premier livre qui a eu déjà beaucoup de succès, qui s'appelait The Rise of Statistical Thinking, donc comment traduire ça, la montée de la pensée scientifique, de la pensée statistique. Et ensuite, quelques temps après, il a écrit un autre livre qui s'appelle Trust in Numbers, The Pursuit of Objectivity in Science and Public Life, qui est donc qui pose la question de savoir pourquoi est-ce qu'on croit dans les nombres, pourquoi est-ce que les nombres engendrent de la confiance. Et c'est un livre qui a vraiment fait date, que maintenant tout le monde cite. En fait, je pense que si on prend toutes les interventions de tous les gens qui sont venus, on l'a tous cité. Donc c'est très simple. Voilà, donc je vais donner 3 quarts d'heure à Ted pour parler, présenter son exposé, qui sera en anglais. Ted parle. Ah oui, alors d'autres points. Ted parle parfaitement bien le français, mais on a décidé de ne pas le torturer, et donc on l'a autorisé à parler en anglais. En revanche, si vous voulez poser vos questions à la suite de l'intervention en français, c'est tout à fait possible. Ted comprend parfaitement. Voilà, donc on va écouter Ted pendant 3 quarts d'heure.
It's a pleasure for me to be here in Brussels and to hear these quite clear talks in French. And I wish I could match Haro, whom you properly thanked for speaking in French, but I don't think you would thank me, même si je parle un peu de français et je peux peut-être comprendre les questions, but I would run out of steam. So you want it still closer? Yes. Is that better? Okay. I have tried in this talk to address some questions that were suggested in the original proposals topics for this conference, and one of those is to emphasize data. At least the task that was given to me involved the way data can structure knowledge, and I will take that up at least a little bit. Yeah, and actually, beyond that, I want to address issues of the public uses of knowledge, and to take up especially the problem that we sometimes don't get what we want. That is that our plans are not always what we realize. And the way so it is in a way not only the successes but the limitations of data and statistics in the world, and that is not simply or mainly a matter of skepticism, but recognition of perhaps the strategies that are more honest and that get us in the directions we want to go. And I'm especially interested actually in seeing number as and quantity not only as knowledge but as a form of action, as something that changes the world, and to look at at these political dimensions. Let's see. Oops, we are not advancing. Okay, so and my the question I raised is about the uses of numbers. I would emphasize one interesting kind of language that is very much used in my country, and I'm not sure whether people talk this way, so you can correct me. But one speaks of data-driven knowledge as data-driven, and that is usually, I think, always regarded as highly favorable. That is, knowledge should be data-driven. But I think if we really are going to claim data-drivenness, as the way of knowledge, then we're supposing that the data can act on its own, and that human thought and reason sink into the background, that when people, the role of the people in interpreting and defending is a kind of defense. So to say that knowledge is data-driven, or should be data-driven, is to make it almost automatic, and I think that's it's impossible and undesirable at the same time. I mean, I can understand, especially in our own time, why people have talked that way. That is, we seem often to be threatened by ideas that deny the role of science, that deny the role of proper knowledge of our accumulated expertise over the years as we make our decisions, and some political figures of recent times have been quite callous about pushing aside, ignoring all the things that we know. There have been systematic efforts to undermine that kind of knowledge, and so it's not surprising. Indeed, it's laudable in many ways that we should instead emphasize that our data should respect what we know. Now, to reduce that to data, I love data, and without data, we are almost hopeless, and yet the data isn't sufficient by itself. So this focus on data-driven kind of suggests that knowledge occurs almost automatically, and that is not the case. So, in a way, I think that the current focus on the data-driven, on what data should do almost by itself, reflects actually a kind of fear or a hesitation about insisting on scientific knowledge, for which data is extremely important, but which is not limited to data and can't be. The data isn't knowledge all by itself. It is of quite general significance, but it also interacts with forms of human other ways of thinking, or with all the tools we have for understanding and comprehending things in the world. And again, I think that in a way, the focus on data as sufficient, almost sufficient unto itself, is a withdrawal from the challenge we face in science, and I think actually even I don't know that I'll say especially, but certainly also in statistics, which is in fact not only the accumulation of data, it is the expert accumulation of data, and beyond that, the application of tools that have developed over the years, over the centuries, for analyzing that knowledge, for the data that is for getting from the data a kind of knowledge that we can use and that makes our thinking better. So I am fascinated by data. I actually have turned the attention of my own work in some ways in most recent times to data. I mean, as such, rather than looking at the statistical, rather than looking first of all at the statistical tools that we bring to bear in our knowledge. So data is fascinating and has a fascinating history unto itself. It isn't all by itself. It is associated with all kinds of knowledge, field-specific knowledge, as well as the kind of general information that we associate with data. That is, we have our data, and then we have all the kinds of knowledge that are particular to certain kinds of data, and that's part of the story too. So should we accept the limits on our knowing that might come with saying, it all comes down to data, that data is a sufficient answer? It isn't. The focus on data reflects, I think, the fear, in a way, the reluctance of science sometimes to insist on the intellectual skills and the training and the bodily skills as well as intellectual ones that make for knowledge. That we have sometimes become afraid of that, and if we pretend that knowledge is simply data-driven, that the data forces our knowledge, we are giving up. We're failing to recognize the kind of complex skill that is really fundamental to science, as to so much, almost everything that we know. Yeah, and I would say, even also, quantification is extremely important, and again, it comes allied to other forms, other practices, other intellectual practices that are part of knowledge. So, I think that the English language is the worst language in this respect in drawing a sharp distinction between knowledge and between science and other forms of knowledge, and I prefer to think of different knowledge forms as allied, even if there are different practices associated with different branches of knowledge and different fields. Okay, well, data. I say a few words about data more, and one thing. I kind of mentioned this already. It's a fascinating topic, actually, for people like historians or sociologists who are interested in the history of our knowledge. Not uniquely perhaps, but where we have compilations of data, we can look back and find how it was gathered up. That where did it come from? The work that I did most recently, the book I wrote about mental institutions, that includes institutions for people who were classified as mentally ill or insane, as well as people classified as for slow learning, so perhaps as mentally handicapped or disadvantaged, or that this kind of knowledge actually, or that this kind of data did not just, wasn't there all the time and didn't, appear magically, but was closely associated with the perception of a social problem, the creation of hospitals and special schools designed to try to correct this problem, and the accumulation of all kinds of information in these institutions, so that the institutions were products of the phenomenon that the data was intended to amass, to accumulate. It was part of the same process. That is so that data actually, I kind of came to realize that when you look at data, you immediately are led to all kinds of institutions where the data is gathered and used. And that makes great material for the social sciences and for history as we try to understand how it works. So I call this data in the world. That is, data doesn't just happen. It happens when people with, or people with certain ambitions, but eventually for institutions that have the means to accumulate this kind of information, this kind of knowledge, create it. And again, it's not the kind of much of the data that we are accustomed to seeing embodies a kind of knowledge on a large scale. So it takes complex institutions and complex practices to accumulate it, and for us to understand it. involves looking into the activities that are associated with it. And again, I want to emphasize that's something that matters in the world. It's about knowledge that is important, and not just about knowledge, that as if the knowledge just dropped from the sky. Often I think that knowledge goes beyond particular purposes. That is one of the limits of saying, of pretending that data is sufficient, of pretending that the data is sort of already there, or that begins with data, or that knowledge reduces to data. One disadvantage is that we perhaps focus on perhaps an important thing, but which is not the only thing. That is that what we are trying to measure, however important, it can be damaging if we treat it as sufficient in itself. I'll give one recent or famous now example of this, which is much criticized, and that is, so I'll just say GDP. That is the gross domestic product. We hardly ever say that anymore, and there's been much discussion, I think justified, about the limits of this kind of a measurement, which was created in the 1930s and especially the 1940s. That is in the time of the Second World War, and coming after a Great Depression in North America and Europe, and in some ways in the whole world. And the kind of measurement that this index, GDP, represented was a way of trying to assess, how well our resources were being utilized, and whether there were ways that it could be used, that they could be expanded, could be increased, so that, for instance, so that unemployment and hunger, shortcomings of production could be reduced, and then actually much more important still in the war, so that how to convert resources from one use to another use, and try to guarantee that they were all being used effectively, to measure the quantity of production in order to try to maximize production, and to be as efficient as possible. And it is often argued by critics that this was quite appropriate for the time of wartime mobilization, and much more problematical in the post-war period, where again GDP just isn't it has its significance, but it's not sufficient for all purposes. And if you think about it, it leads to some things which are quite damaging. And there are many things that don't fit into the measurement very well, and if the GDP is taken too seriously, we leave out other crucial factors that, like in the old days, until recently to some degree still, for instance, the labor of women in the household, which was not part of production, but was, for many people, and yet was clearly valuable and even necessary. Or more recently, there's been much focus on environmental values, which again are, there are efforts to try to incorporate them, or to incorporate that in some other way, but it's a deeply problematical tool. So for many cases, there are many measures which are not sufficient. That might be worth measuring them, but we would need always to be aware of their limitations, of the things that they leave out that are also important, and find ways to balance attention between these different things. Okay, so I say that, and then I want to say that even there are some cases where the measurement really is the thing we care about. I'm going to give. Actually, I haven't tried to to think what are all the examples. Maybe someone will take up this question after I finish talking. But one obvious kind of thing is a census, or even more obvious, an election. An election, I mean, that is the numerical outcome of the election is the thing we want. And it doesn't, there may be lots of deeper things about why people vote the way they do that are also quite interesting, but the outcome of an election is given by a vote count. And, turns out votes vote counts are not impossible, but they are actually quite challenging, and they demand real attention. And my own country has been subjected more aggressively than for a long time, at least in some ways than ever, by actually a categorical denial that we can count, or by a charge without any support that the numbers are false, that they've been corrupted, and this was announced. This was announced and is being announced now in other United States elections, that this is a fraud, that we know it's crooked, that it's dishonest. Well, and against that, arguments and evidence that the count is fair and accurate, or at least very close to accurate, and we can probably estimate the inaccuracy, which is very slight. But that kind of thing is very important, and yet it too doesn't reduce to anything so simple as just it's not like counting the votes is a simple matter. It's it's quite complex. It takes skills at many levels: political, technical, statistical, and again, to say, well, I mean, to treat the data as if it were, or whatever, as if it were transparent, as if that were easy to know, and that's all we need to know, and we can answer the question, is inaccurate. In fact, it's to say, let the data decide. To say let it be data driven. Well, I mean, okay, you could, but the data doesn't drive, right, until a lot of expertise is brought to bear on a count. That's true for an election. It's certainly true for a census. And again, actually, the accuracy of censuses has been both very much threatened sometimes. That is, and denied. So I mean, maybe these two go together to try to corrupt the census, and to claim that it's false. So you can make it false if you corrupt it, but so again, to suppose that data is just given, that data can dominate. I mean, so there are times when that's close enough. I mean, we're not concerned with the more complex dimensions, but we really need to recognize that quantitative work, including data work, involves skills that are acquired with difficulty, that can be corrupted, that can be threatened, and sometimes are threatened, and it's quite prominent in our own time. Faced with the question, can the data solve our problems? Well, yes, but not all by itself. It's actually, we're dealing with real science and real quantitative science, and even and social science, and things going beyond the straightforward, what seems like a simple thing like counting, and it isn't very simple, at least when numbers are very large. Yeah, then I guess I already said beyond that there are cases when the numbers are only, or you're measuring something which is important but which is not the only thing, and one has to recognize the limits of those numbers and to look for ways to take in the things that matter, associated with those numbers. So I mean, I've been, so far expressing, if not skepticism, at least emphasizing the importance of recognizing the skills and the intelligence that is required to produce accurate, reliable numbers. At the same time, so that is I think this is one of the ambitions that has been associated with movement we call science studies, or STS, that is social studies of science, whatever, is to recognize that the greater complexity than is often admitted in public discussion of things like of science, and perhaps especially of statistics, where it's often supposed that the numbers are authoritative. So it's important to recognize the complexity of these things, and yet at the same time, I don't want to say that emphasizing complexity isn't the only thing, and we need also to be prepared to defend as excellent numbers when they really are excellent. So there's a danger also in emphasizing too much the complexity and the difficulty. If numbers are to serve the public, if numbers are to serve democracy, it's important to believe, to do what you can, and then to believe that you have numbers that are reliable enough, that they are reliable good enough for the purpose that we have. So I do not want science studies to undermine this possibility, but to recognize the kind of skill that goes into this work, to advance it and to defend it. Just oops. So the politics of numbers, on the one hand, has to be recognized, but but not to the point that we deny the possibility of having numbers that are meaningful, that we can rely on. I guess I would say in our more critical discussions of numbers, we might sometimes say, and we sometimes should say, that it's authoritarian in a way. It's undemocratic to claim that the problems have been solved, that everything is known, that science can decide. But at the same time, to emphasize too strongly the flexibility or the unknowability or the weakness of numbers, that undermines. Okay, so I mean, leaving the experts in charge seems to undermine democracy, and in a way really does sometimes, but emphasizing instead too much the legitimacy of debate, as if we don't know or can't know, or as if professional scientists and statisticians are somehow taking control from the democracy. To actually to put it that way, itself undermines democracy, which does depend in the end on numbers, on accurate, reliable numbers that can be trusted. So numbers are somehow they can be used undemocratically, but uncertainty can be invoked in a way which is just as damaging or more damaging to democracy. So I'm interested in the public uses of numbers and what kind of a history we can have of public numbers and what that tells us about our political societies and our, the social world that we occupy. Statistics, I am not not giving you here any kind of a chronological development of the kind that we usually associate with history, but of course these tools, the numbers, are the products of historical development and are enmeshed in all kinds of fascinating social situations, which are at issue here. And in fact, statistics, well, it's impossible to say, when there was first statistics, but the word itself came to be used and was, in a systematic way around the beginning of around 1800, 1790, 1800, 1810. It was associated with a push for a kind of expert politics, for trying to rationalize commerce and elections and things like that. And it actually, it was, somebody already quoted, I think, the lies, the famous line, lies, damned lies and statistics. Such charges were sometimes made, and people who were faced with suspicion of statistics like to emphasize how straightforward they could be. The Statistical Society of London in the 1830s famously declared that their science was about facts, and they passed a resolution for a time which refused to allow expressions of opinions at the meeting. And a critic said, actually opinion is just another word for thought. There's no need to exclude that from the Statistical Society. And this person goes on to say, they are a bunch of fools for saying something like this. But in fact, a certain anxiety about being too aggressive about our numbers has been present, in a way, almost from the beginning of, at least of this modern form of statistics. It's a delicate matter, but I will insist again that, a bit of modesty is always appropriate, but we should need to insist on the validity of what is valid, and there is a lot of that. Okay, the last point I want to make about in this topic, the topic I'm introducing here or discussing here is about one other kind of use of numbers, which I think is more troublesome, more problematical, more worrisome for us, and this involves attempts, again, actually, to reduce, reduce rational understanding to a kind of automatic product of numbers. I've become especially interested in, I become interested in these kinds of numbers in general, but there's a special kind of focus and a special degree of kind of problematical aspect that has developed in quite recent times. We might associate it with, the economic changes associated with the 1970s and 1980s, the new public management, or new one. I'm off again. Oh. Okay. So, okay, so sometimes called neoliberalism, and I've become quite interested in the ways that the use of numbers, or the hope for numbers as the solution to our problems, how that can lead to distortions of what we are trying to achieve with numbers. Again, any idea that numbers can automatically lead us to our goals is going to create problems. And I just thought I would say a little bit about this, but let's just, let me, what can I do with this? Oh, right in my hand here. Oops. I want to finish by suggesting a few ways in which numbers, which we usually take, and sometimes correctly, as claims about, as knowledge claims, as claims about what is, about how many, or what, often when used as incentives, which has been it's an old story, but is especially prominent, and again in the last several decades, actually turns numbers from forms of knowledge, or from, let's say, simple, not really simple, but from something which is to be understood first of all as a knowledge form, into something which sometimes has to be understood as an intervention. So what do I mean? Well, let me just give one or two. Actually, I have 5 examples here, but I don't think I'm going to do that. So, some examples, and one of these is I would take, it's just, take from the work I described. I recently did on mental institutions, insane asylums, and the institutions got they were charged with producing something worthwhile. They, in the early years being, let's say, around 1820, 1830, 1840, 1850, they were extremely optimistic. They suggested that they were saving more money than they were spending, that by curing all these patients, they were making society more efficient and not simply providing some kind of, a place where the poor, the insane could be taken care of, or where they might, be cured even. And they emphasized the benefits they were given to society, and they tried to justify that with the numbers, which they collected lots of numbers. It didn't work very well, and first they claimed lots and lots of cures. And I guess I don't have time to, if somebody wants to ask, because what they did is kind of hilarious, but they found ways to reduce, to measure cure rates, and to wait until the patient either died or was cured in order to make a determination, so that they showed extremely high rates of extremely high effectiveness, even sometimes as high as 100%. But they waited. How do you do that? They waited until perhaps until the patient died before they they declared a success, and they might even maybe not even, I'm sorry, a failure. And maybe not even then, because they could say they would have cured the patient later. So, in fact, these numbers are, it was hard to define what would be an appropriate way for a disease like mental illness. At what point do you give up? And well, it sounds, admirable if you don't give up, if you keep trying. But if you don't give up and you keep trying, meaning you never accept that you have failed, then you get excellent numbers, which are completely unreliable and kind of hilarious. But here's the other thing that happened to them, and which they insisted on. If they were intertwined with other kinds of institutions, like hospitals or like prisons, and if in a prison, and they were medical, so if in a prison, the prisons themselves were being judged by maintaining some kind of health, avoiding epidemics, so they might well decide when a patient was about to die to transfer them to the mental institution, which was a medical institution, and so it seemed appropriate that they should have the patients there. But so now here's the other side of this, that the mental institution received a patient who was about to die, and should they have to write that down as a death, attributed to them? Well, they didn't think so. So, and you can kind of sympathize with them. So everybody, in fact, is what it was, held up at first as a simple kind of objective measure of success, of health success, of cures from mental illness, was in fact became a site of struggle. It was inevitably a site of struggle. It was extremely difficult, even by expert people, to decide how these measures should be done. So anyhow, my point is that faced with situations like that, it was almost inevitable that they would be the numbers would be corrupted, or would become difficult. That is, to handle these numbers, they were altering them. The numbers were almost automatically corrupted by the process. And it's in the case of like the institutions receiving a patient who's about to die, it's hard to argue with them. But anyhow, it's an example of a system of incentives. The incentive, they wanted to have incentives so that the institutions would be rewarded for having cures and for keeping people alive, and yet other different institutions were competing for this, and the use of the attempt to assess the institutions by the numbers led almost inevitably to their corruption.
You have 3 minutes left.
Yeah. Well, I'll just mention just one more, I guess, which Emmanuel has already mentioned, Wendy Espelon's work, and she has a nice study of some journalistic work which was used to judge, all kinds of institutions, but she's been especially interested in law schools. And so didn't take a lot of institutional power to do this. It just took a journal which decided to rate people. Now, ratings have become so common, and many ratings which might not be so bad if they were done, kind of privately and were used for private discussion. If once they become uniform measures used with force to judge the quality of institutions, then the institutions had to respond somehow and to try to correct these numbers by, in fact, by corrupting the numbers, and they found themselves forced to do lots of things they thought were not at all useful for the educational mission, but which, without taking on these or doing these things they thought useless, their institutions were going to be judged very unfavorably. So again, as it were, the creation of an incentive, of a measurement, led almost ineluctably, almost necessarily to the corruption of the measurement, and so that kind of thing is quite uniform. Any thought, and it highlights the point I'm trying to make here, that numbers are both fascinating and extreme and potentially extremely valuable, but there are all kinds of situations in which they can be quite damaging. And I have, I'm not going to mention the others I have on my list, but we have to recognize numbers as malleable and subtle, as expert, but also corruptible, to recognize that they come with responsibility if we're to use them effectively. So thank you.